Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, RBM, the Missing Link, Bringing Drugs to Market Efficiently. My name is Kalyani Nayaka, and I'm a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Medidata, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. Our speakers today are David Nickerson, who's the Head of Clinical Quality Management at EMD Serono, Colin B. Ahern, Senior Manager at Accenture, Global Life Sciences R&D, and Stacy Yount, Vice President of Product for Strategic Monitoring at Medidata Solutions. We're thrilled to bring you a lineup of industry-renowned speakers and subject matter experts today on the topic of risk-based monitoring. You can read our speaker's full bio on the right side of your window, but I just want to mention a few technical notes before we get started. This webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in information. For the best audio quality, please make sure that your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some of your common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and it will be available to you on demand within 24 hours after the event. And we will follow the presentation today with a Q&A session. So please start to submit your questions using the Q&A button that's located on the left side of your screen. In today's webinar, over the next 35 minutes or so, our speakers will present their initial remarks, followed by a panel-type discussion around the what, the why, and the how of a holistic, quality-based approach to monitoring, and how ICH E6 guidance on RBM can fundamentally transform monitoring approaches to help keep up with the fast-paced trials. With that, Dave, I'd like to turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Kalyani, and welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining today. Traditional approaches to monitoring the quality of clinical trials have focused heavily on frequent and extensive on-site monitoring visits, with a strong emphasis on source data verification. It has long been understood that there are significant costs associated with such an approach, and that these methods are not as effective as we might like, and certainly not as efficient as we'd like. The very first project that the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative chose to initiate had as its objective to determine the most effective and efficient methods for monitoring. In a survey that generated 65 responses, CITI found that while a variety of different monitoring practices were being used across the clinical trial enterprise, no single approach appeared to be sufficiently productive, and more importantly, there was no real logic behind the selection of one approach over another. We all recognize that clinical trial sponsors have finite resources available to them to expend on clinical research. Using those resources as efficiently as possible is essential in order to maximize the productivity of our clinical drug development efforts. Any resources that are spent on clinical trial-related activities that are either ineffective or inefficient are resources that can't be used to run additional trials. Ultimately, this has the potential to impact the number of new medications that are made available to patients. In other words, there is an opportunity cost associated with ineffective or inefficient research. ICH E6 R2, which was approved in November of 2016, is the globally harmonized guideline that now describes a risk-based approach to quality management, which is helping to transform the way that we manage quality in our clinical trials. Specifically, this guideline highlights the need for us to adopt a systematic, prioritized, and risk-based approach to monitoring our clinical trials, focusing proactively on those factors that really matter most to patient safety and data reliability, and to systematically identify and prioritize the risks that, if they were to occur, could have a significant impact on these quality drivers. The guideline goes on to state that we should take actions to prevent or mitigate these important risks from occurring, and that the actions that we choose to take should be proportionate to the predicted significance of the risks that we've identified. With this understanding of what is critical to quality and the risks which are important to quality, we should then be thoughtful about designing a strategy to monitor the study that takes full advantage of all of our monitoring capabilities, including on-site, off-site, and centralized monitoring, in a manner that is best suited to the specific needs of the specific study. So, although ICH E6R2 is now encouraging us to adopt a risk-based approach as we consider the best way to monitor each trial, it remains constant in requiring that we continue to focus on ensuring the safety of study participants and the reliability of the data being generated from those studies. Now, we in the industry, in an effort to be fully compliant with the regulations, sometimes have a tendency to adopt a conservative interpretation of the requirements that are being addressed in new guidances. And so, as we consider this new guidance for risk-based quality management, there are a handful of key messages that I think are worth taking away. The first is to be thoughtful and proactive. Take the time up front to be thoughtful about your clinical trial and to build quality into the trial from the very beginning. Ensure that the study protocol and the associated operational plans are appropriately focused on delivering the critical data and the critical processes for the study. And proactively control the risks that pose the greatest threat to patient safety and data reliability. We should collaborate and break down the silos. As we build quality into our trials, we should ensure that we're being inclusive and leveraging the expertise and the full capabilities of those functions, organizations, and vendors that are involved in the execution of our clinical trials. We should focus on what matters most. Ensure that the majority of our quality management efforts are focused on the data and processes that are critical to quality for the study. And identify the risks. As a precursor to adopting a risk-based approach, it's of course necessary to identify those risks that are most likely to have a significant impact on patient safety and/or data reliability. Our risk management efforts should be focused on controlling and monitoring those risks that are most important. And developing a monitoring strategy for each study that takes the specific needs and risks for that particular study into account. That strategy should again make a greater emphasis on monitoring and controlling those data and processes that are most critical to quality and focusing oversight on important risks. And finally, we should leverage a variety of different methods to monitor the study, choosing those methods that are best suited to the specific needs from a risk-based point of view for that specific study. Okay, I'll now turn it over to Colin.
Thanks, Dave. Great insights into RBM. Thank you. So when thinking about change and organizational change, change is hard at an individual and a personal level. So managing and navigating the organizational impact to a successful, sustained future state is challenging. So here's some 5 topics to consider when moving to a new paradigm. And the key challenges that you're typically overcoming are cultural. One, we've always done it this way, and so we want to continue to do it this way. And then typically the systems are in place to support that current state, and so you need to move beyond that. The first part is around the vision, establishing a clear vision that is actively supported by leadership. And that would typically include things like a vision and mission statement and working on change branding. The next is skills. You need to understand your organization if they have the right people and skills in place. And that's typically achieved through a change impact analysis, where you look at each role and the impact, and we'll talk more about that on the next slide. The third thing is around supporting assets, so ensuring that you've provided the correct tools and templates for supporting this new paradigm. You also need to bake into your performance objectives those traits and those features that you want to have represented in the new paradigm, and that's usually represented through your program rewards and recognition. And you want to have a series of plans that will drive and monitor the change to the targeted steady state. And that includes things like your change communication plans, training plans, and change monitoring. And what we found working with clients is that invest the time in educating impacted stakeholders on the rationale for implementing RBM. And training on the tool and process isn't always sufficient to make it happen. You need to really drive home the reason and the rationale. Another key takeaway is around investing time in the risk assessment discussions and including members across all functions. And another message is around identifying the study team members as early as possible and avoiding turnover. And that enables you to have continuity as you're moving through the adoption. So I mentioned the change impact assessments. So across the top, you can see a simplified risk management process culminating in monitoring. So going across there, we identify critical data and processes, identify risks, plan how to take action, and actually perform the risk-based monitoring. And the risk-based monitoring spans across central monitoring, which enables looking across sites and targeting of sites experiencing challenges and addressing them, and also looking for trends and outliers in your data. Remote monitoring is around interpreting information from a central assessment and managing those risks or issues remotely. And then the classic on-site monitoring is the focus on the high-value activities, and you visit those sites based on identified risks and the critical data based on your plans. And you can see in the circle there some of the key roles that we've seen that have been highly impacted in our work. These roles, we assess these roles across people, process, and technology with a focus on those tasks supporting key decisions, outcomes, or impacts to regulatory compliance. Now, key factors to consider before implementing span across what is your strategy? So what will your organization's approach be to risk-based monitoring, and will it be applied across your portfolio of studies or just a subset? Who are the impacted stakeholders? Specifically, how does your organization leverage CROs? How will you engage these stakeholders through the journey? And then lastly is around what is your existing baseline of RBM-related processes and systems, and how will those need to change to support the new strategy? So what we're seeing in the industry is varying adoption rates. And Stacy's now going to speak to why we are seeing these varying levels of adoptions and strategies to overcome these obstacles.
Stacy, are you on?
I am. Sorry, Kalyani, I was on mute. Apologies for that, everyone. Thanks, Colin. So across sponsors and CROs, we're actually seeing that most have implemented RBM, at least to some extent. But that implementation is either early on in its adoption or it's a matter of compliance with ICH E6 regulatory requirements, which is a good thing. But it may not have trickled down yet into the cultural and behavioral aspects of employees that are working on studies every day. And that's really where we're seeing one of the largest obstacles. So as you see here, there are three that we've listed out that are primary. And on the far left is the primary one that we're seeing culturally, and that is that even though we may be reducing SDV from a compliance standpoint and what we're requiring on a trial, we're still seeing that culturally teams are tending to do more 100% SDV than what we're intending. And then the second main obstacle that we're seeing is that we haven't yet been able to apply risk across studies, learning from one study to the next. We are still conducting risk assessments at the trial level and haven't yet ingrained those across. And you can see some examples here of what the output of that is, that we might struggle with protocol compliance from one study to the next, because we may have found issues with compliance in study A that we haven't yet applied to the other studies in our portfolio. And then one of the bigger outcomes of this is just overall site performance not improving across studies or over time as that study team and that site has experience across protocols. And then lastly on here, you'll see on the far right is just repeated data quality issues. We are seeing this is occurring because teams are still reviewing data based on old tools and methodology and really missing the trends and important signals in a study because we're relying on old methods to be able to do that. So those are the primary obstacles that we're seeing. And another obstacle is simply that teams and organizations struggle with where to start. What we've begun to do at Medidata is to encourage sponsors and CROs to start in either a large change management approach that you heard Colin describe that can be well organized and it can have a team of experts around you who know how to do the change management process from the beginning of that careful consideration all the way through the implementation on your first study, subsequent study. But what we're also seeing and encouraging with some sponsors that may not yet have the ability to take on such a large program is to start small. Start with a risk-based approach. And as you can see here, this is a pictorial of Medidata's platform, technology platform for risk-based monitoring. And what we're recommending is as you're implementing this, to begin with the risk assessment. That's really the heart of RBM, is to do those careful considerations at the beginning of the trial that Colin described earlier, focusing on patient safety and data reliability, and then begin to implement the next and subsequent aspects of the risk-based monitoring process and an overall platform. Within our platform, we then also have a central monitoring capability which leverages machine learning to provide powerful insights to the end users about potential patterns and outliers in the study. You remember in the previous slide I shared that one of the obstacles was that we tend to rely on historical processes and techniques when implementing RBM, and that can be one of the obstacles. Well, what we're seeing with this central monitoring capability that we've launched in the platform is providing those enhanced machine learning insights into the study really helps to power and strengthen the overall implementation of risk-based monitoring. And then as you tie in your site monitoring to those insights that you're keying off of your risk assessment, you're able to then drive site monitoring behaviors based on the risks of the study rather than relying back on that 100% STV. And then also wrapped around all of this, an important aspect of an RBM platform is issue management. We're seeing that the ability to share insights and information and issues across the study and across study teams help to break down those silos that you heard Dave and Colin mention earlier. So having the underlying foundational powerful ability of managing issues across study team members helps to ensure that those insights about the trial are well known and communicated and issues are closed out then in a timely manner across the team. So risk-based monitoring has actually proven to have some significant and powerful quality benefits that we talked about earlier that are so very important, and that is improved patient safety as well as improved data reliability. That's the ultimate goal, and it should always be our primary goal when implementing risk-based monitoring. We're also seeing some really tangible benefits to operational effectiveness and overall cost of conducting trials. We're sharing a few examples here that we have seen in the industry And on the far left, you see that on one study team, on one phase 3 study, the implementation of reduced SDV and the power of a risk-based approach was able to gain more than $1 million in savings just from reducing those monitoring visits and the overall cost of those. We also have an example here of the savings of 10 days off of data cleaning cycles. This measurement came about as a goal to a study that was reducing SDV and implementing a risk-based approach, where they wanted to ensure that while reducing SDV, they were still maintaining a high level of quality and efficiency. Well, what they found was it was actually improving it overall, and that 10-day cycle time was the time that it was taking to get queries closed out and visits clean. And then lastly, there's an example of the far right of being able to reduce the data reviews on an individual study. And this is a measurement of taking the data management reviews that are happening on a routine basis throughout the course of the study and reducing those so that we're now implementing a risk-based approach, a targeted approach to the way data is reviewed, and also reducing those manual reviews that could be supplemented by the machine learning technology that I noted earlier that can be a core aspect of a risk-based monitoring platform implementation. But regardless of where you are in your implementation of RBM, if you are just implementing it on the initial studies, or if you've done what we've seen with some clients that have had more than 50 to 100 studies implement RBM, regardless of where we are, I believe that Colin, Dave, and I probably all agree that we're still early in our implementation of risk-based monitoring in the industry. We have a long way to go and such huge potential in front of us still. What we'd encourage all of you to do is, no matter where you are on that spectrum, press forward to ensure that RBM becomes a cultural and a behavioral aspect of everything you do on a study so that you really can get to those tangible improvements for overall patient safety, data quality and reliability, and efficiency. And at the end of the day, when you do that, our patients win. We get drugs to market faster, more efficiently, and with higher quality, and that's all of our ultimate #1 goal. So with that, we will now transition in, and before jumping into a panel discussion, we'd first like to ask you all some poll questions. So with that, Kalyani, can you please launch the poll?
Sure, Stacy. Thank you. Audience members, thank you for listening in. We've launched our poll. We'd love to hear your input. So the question is, if you followed an RBM approach in one or more of your studies, which of the following did you choose as your starting point? And you can select all of those that apply. Your options are documentation of risk assessment, a centralized monitoring approach that used statistics to identify errors, a reduced source data verification approach, site monitoring prioritized by riskier sites, or none of the above because you haven't started an RBM approach as yet. So we'll give you a minute or so to fill out the questions and fill out the responses, and then we'll take a look at the responses here. Once again, the question is, if you followed an RBM approach in one or more of your studies, which of the following did you choose as your starting point? All right, another 10 seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. All right, we're closing the poll now, and we'll take a look at the responses here. All right, excellent. So we have almost half of you saying that documentation of risk assessment is your starting point, followed by both a centralized monitoring approach as well as a site monitoring approach that's prioritized by riskier sites. And then we have almost 30% of you saying that you haven't started an RBM approach as yet, followed by 23% that took a reduced STV approach. So that's really interesting. Stacy, do you have any comments on these responses, and how does this compare to what you've seen in the industry?
Sure. Yes, actually, this aligns quite well with what I've seen out in the industry across sponsors of all sizes and CRO partners. We do tend to implement the risk assessment first, and that makes perfect sense. That's actually quite logical, and it's where you probably should start. What I would encourage us to do, though, something that I have seen, is that once that risk assessment is done, there are some teams that tend to stop there, and they don't ensure that that assessment, the identification of the critical data and critical processes, the overall risks that are identified, don't trickle down into the central monitoring processes and tools and technologies. And therefore, that kind of comes back to my comment earlier about implementation by compliance rather than a cultural behavior. So I would encourage that once these risk assessments are done, the output of them really need to drive the process and the central monitoring capabilities, data management, site monitoring, to make sure that they live on and that we embed that risk then into the follow-on processes downstream.
That's great, Stacy. Thank you for that. So continuing on with our panel discussion here, Colin, question for you. So from your work with the sponsors that have implemented an RBM approach, I've heard you say before that there's a lot of pain associated with change. You talked earlier about change management and cultural impact, but I want to dig a little deeper. What caused some of these sponsors to change despite the pain?
Yeah, I think the big thing I've seen is bold leadership, organizations with bold leadership, and leadership that is fundamentally aligned with the benefits and the ultimate value to the patients. And I think in addition to that, strong partnerships that these organizations have, and that could be across vendors and other partnerships. I think that's what enables them to be steadfast and tackle such a challenging move. So, Dave, that's my experience. So, regardless, RBM is still getting a bad rap in some circles. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. So I think you've mentioned this on a number of occasions, and I know Stacy has mentioned this as well, but I think the root of the challenge here comes back to culture. Culture is a very, very difficult thing to change, and as we look to adopt a more risk-based approach to not only how we monitor clinical trials, but how we manage quality in our studies from an overall risk-based perspective, it really does require that we both think differently, think from a perspective where we are focusing our attention on what is critical to quality, what really matters most, but to also adopt a risk-based approach where we're actually choosing to accept some risks on the basis of an understanding that some of those risks do not pose as significant a threat to patient safety and data quality as other risks do. And from an overall prioritization perspective, we need to change our culture, change our approach to, essentially adopt an approach whereby we are focusing our resources, our attention, our capital on addressing those aspects of the clinical trial that are most critical to be controlled. And I think creating that culture where this becomes a part of our DNA is not something that necessarily happens overnight. I think there are a number of other more detailed changes that need to take place in terms of, across the industry from an organization to an organization point of view. We're all probably working through the process of understanding who actually takes ownership of these processes and who drives those processes. What is the process from an end-to-end point of view, moving from the risk-based, the risk analysis portion of a process into the perspective of the process whereby we're transforming that understanding of risk into an operational practice for managing quality in our studies. And then there's the tools, the different tools. There's so many different tools that are available to us, and taking the existing architecture of tools that we have in place and kind of transforming that architecture to be fit for purpose for the objective that we have in front of us now is all a process. It's all a challenge, and frankly, I think it takes some time.
That's great, Dave. Those are some really interesting insights right there. At this time, I'd just like to remind our attendees, please send us your questions, and we've got a few coming in already, and we'll get to that at the end of the panel discussion. But we'd love to hear from you. Please use the Q&A box on the left side of your screen to enter your questions in. But at this time, we'd actually like to hear from you again, and we're going to ask you one more poll question. All right, so you should be able to see it on your screen right now. Or the next thing we'd like to hear from you about is about RBM effectiveness. What is the most appropriate way to measure RBM effectiveness? Is it from a time savings perspective, or cost savings, or better quality, or all of the above? What's been your experience in measuring the RBM effectiveness? So we'll give you another 15 to 20 seconds to respond to this question. What is the most appropriate way to measure RBM effectiveness? Time savings, cost savings, better quality, or all of the above? All right, we'll go ahead and close the poll now. And here are the responses. So all of the above definitely gets the highest percentage here, with almost 70% of you saying that time savings, cost savings, and increased quality are the ways to measure RBM effectiveness. Dave, what's your comment on these responses?
Yeah, I don't think this is really a surprise, Kalyani. I probably would have answered the survey the exact same way. Certainly, RBM presents us with an opportunity to realize savings across all three of these different parameters. But I think first and foremost, it's our obligation in the clinical research space to ensure that whatever method to monitor our trials that we put in place, however we choose to adopt a risk-based approach to managing quality in our studies, the ultimate goal really for the patient has to be on ensuring the safety of those subjects that are participating in our studies, as well as the safety of those patients in the future that ultimately use our medications. And it all really comes back to the reliability of the data that are being generated from these trials, and looking to ensure that those data are actually adequate and sufficient to drive the decision-making that gets made within the walls of each sponsor, but also within the walls of each regulatory agency with regards to, or with respect to, the ultimate approval of each medication.
Dave, I shared examples earlier of how RBM is proving to be effective. What's your opinion about how RBM can help bring drugs to market more efficiently?
I think the more we can be proactive about identifying and preventing issues that could affect quality in our studies, certainly the more efficient we will be in terms of the execution of those trials. That presents us with an opportunity to both run trials much more effectively, achieve the results, and make the decisions that need to be made from a drug development point of view much more efficiently. And certainly, the more we can rely upon the data being generated from these studies to drive that decision-making process, the more effective the overall drug development enterprise becomes for us.
Great, thank you.
That's very interesting. Stacy, we've been talking about critical data and critical processes as something to really focus on as part of this revised guidance to ICH E6. Can you comment on how focusing on critical data and critical processes can actually help achieve better data quality?
Sure. I think it's simple because it helps us focus on what's most important, safety and quality. When you're looking at the critical data and the critical processes, you have forced yourself to take the learnings and the information of the protocol and really ingrain in what's most important to that drug and the patients and the safety into the way then that you are analyzing, reviewing the data, and monitoring the sites. So as you're applying those risk insights into your behaviors with the data and the sites, it's driving you to look at the variables that will have the most impact on data quality and patient safety. And so therefore, when you reduce your focus from everything to a narrower, you're going to get better quality in the end. And we've actually seen several sponsors that have done head-to-head comparisons of studies that were done through 100% SDV and historical processes and systems versus taking a risk-based approach and implementing RBM, and we've seen an improvement to quality measures in there. So I think the evidence is out there, and now it's just really on us to implement.
That's great. Dave or Colin, do you have any additional thoughts about critical data and critical processes and its impact on better data quality?
Yeah, Kellyanne, this is Dave. So I think that I agree, wholeheartedly with what Stacy just said, and I think, just to echo some of those comments, I think that the more we can focus our attention and energy on proactively mitigating the risks that could undermine our ability to generate reliable data from the studies that we execute, the better it is for everybody. And ensuring that I think that process begins with the development of the clinical protocol, to be honest, and looking to ensure that as we develop each clinical protocol for each new clinical study, looking to ensure that we are actually prioritizing and being very explicit with defining the data and processes that are truly critical from a decision-making point of view to the outcome of that clinical trial, the more efficient this whole process becomes for us. And it certainly allows us to focus much more so on identifying those risks that could really have a significant impact on the ultimate outcome and interpretability of the clinical trial. Colin, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I keep going back to the fact that rather than, and Stacy made this point as well as yourself, rather than looking at everything, you're targeting your efforts, right? And I think that's a critical benefit, to be more of an exception and focus on those things that you've deemed most relevant and most critical to your work and your data.
Right, Colin. Thank you. Earlier you talked about some of the implementation factors and cultural factors when considering an RBM approach, but I just want to take a step back and ask, how do you know if RBM is right for your study?
Well, I take a broad and pretty simplistic view. If an organization is thoughtful in its approach, and you can see we've just discussed a lot of the tangible benefits to moving to RBM. From patient safety, increased data quality, cost avoidance. I think that I don't know why you wouldn't. I don't know. Stacey?
Stacey, you might be on mute.
Sorry, everyone. Yes. Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I think that we're at a state now that we just really need to get through those implementation hurdles and implement the first steps. So, yeah, I think that there's really no obvious reason why not to.
Got it. So before we get into our Q&A session, and we've been getting some really interesting questions from all of the attendees here, so I really thank you for sending in your questions. So to wrap up our panel discussion here, Dave, I'd really like to hear from you, considering that you were part of the expert working group that for ICH E6R2. What have been your experiences or advice on some of the challenges you anticipate while complying with this regulation, and what is the best way to deal with them?
Yeah, thanks, Kalyani. I think maybe the primary message I'd like to convey, and this probably goes back to the messages I conveyed in the final slide that I spoke to, is that when ICH E6R2 was developed, the team was very specific about ensuring that that guideline or that guidance described what should be done, but not specifically defining how that needed to be done. And so I think as we all think about how we want to adopt or how we want to implement a risk-based approach to quality management for our clinical trial portfolios, it's very important that we are thoughtful about understanding the principles of what ICH E6R2 is looking to convey, and being very thoughtful and practical about actually going about implementing different methodologies or methodologies that would be consistent with those principles. And again, those principles, I think, are at least some of those principles which I take away as being important were included on that last slide that I'd spoken to.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much, Dave, Colin, and Stacey, for that really engaging panel discussion. It was extremely insightful, but we do have some follow-up questions that help us go into what we already talked about in some more detail. So I'm just going to jump into that. Stacey, this question is for you. Considering RBM, one issue is multiple systems that contain duplicative information. What does Medidata platform offer to streamline this reduction of duplicative systems that would reduce the amount of erroneous data errors that require reconciliation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we have seen is that it's incredibly important to start with the risk assessment in the beginning. Some of you may be using an Excel-based risk tool or some other methodology. What we've done in the Medidata platform is build that in as an integrated tool from the beginning of the study process, so that as you're identifying your risks and your critical data, you're also building your key risk indicators that then are reused and repurposed in the central monitoring technology that I mentioned earlier that leverages machine learning. So you're entering it once from your risk assessment, and that's flowing into then the central monitoring technology downstream. we're also embedding that workflow into the issue management capability to ensure that as you enter an issue, it can flow then to other study team members across functions and keep the communication channels open without having to identify an error or an issue in the system, exit the system and go someplace else and enter issues in that to communicate to the teams. We're trying to keep that, and we have kept that all within the same platform. So those are the two core. And then I think the last thing is that we've just built the systems from scratch around the risk-based monitoring processes and behaviors that are happening in the industry, and we're using that knowledge to build out the platform. So it's based on that integrated approach.
Got it. Got it. Thank you, Stacy. All right, so our next question here is about documenting risks. I'm not sure who wants to take this question, but the question is, what is the best way to document decisions about what risks the organization will accept as part of the initial risk assessment? Does this analysis and rationale have to be entered into the CSR?
I can take that, Kalyani. This is Dave.
Thank you, Dave.
So again, ICH E6R2 does not specify how this needs to be done. But what it does specify is that we should be proactive about determining which risks we would accept and which risks we would choose to proactively mitigate. R2 provides recommendations with respect to how we should prioritize risks based on the severity, rate of occurrence, and degree of detectability for the risks, and describes that on the basis of that overall assessment, we need to make that decision. Now, I can speak for myself and indicate that we have, or I have in the past, defined a threshold on the basis of that level of prioritization, which I used as the basis to determine, again, from a proactive perspective, which risks would be controlled versus which risks would be accepted. And so that's one approach that has been adopted to help standardize that decision-making process. R2 does not specify that this particular decision-making process needs to be described in the CSR. It does identify, though, that we should be able to we should be looking to identify the issues which have occurred during the execution that could have had a significant impact on patient safety or data reliability, and that we should describe and provide context for those issues in the CSR. But again, it doesn't specifically indicate that we should be describing how we've decided which risks to accept versus which risks to mitigate in the CSR.
Got it. Thank you, Dave. So the next question here is about FDA and EMA audits. So the question is, in recent FDA or EMA audits, are the agencies actually reporting findings that sponsors did not perform RBM on a trial?
I can take that one, Kalyani.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead, Dave. And feel free to jump in, Dave, because I think that, yeah, this is a question that's come up quite a bit, so I'd be interested in hearing Colin and Dave, too, to see if you've heard anything about this or findings. I've been trying to watch to see if we've had findings come through or 483s or any kind of evidence out there that RBM issues are coming up in audits and inspections. I haven't seen that yet, but historically, what we have seen is typically when there is a new guidance out, the findings tend to lag behind the new guidance. So I think it's just a matter of time between when it's released and the time we start to see those findings. But perhaps Dave or Colin, one of you may have seen something out there that's been published, but I have not yet seen any evidence that we've had formal findings yet.
Yes, Stacy, I can confirm that I haven't seen any written evidence that either FDA, EMA, or PMDA, for that matter, are going to these lengths. In preparation for today's session, however, I did reach out to some colleagues, some folks in my network, and to try to seek information about their experiences. Based on the feedback that I received, I can confirm that sponsors are being asked to describe how they are adopting a risk-based approach to managing quality in their studies, not specifically risk-based monitoring as in RBM per se, but how are they adopting, how are they evaluating the risks to quality in their studies, and how are they integrating that concept or that understanding into the approach that they're taking to manage their trials. So those questions are being asked, but I haven't heard of any penalties or findings or observations being described as a result of those questions.
Interesting.
Interesting. So our next question is about RBM in the developing world. Do you have any RBM experience in the developing world? I guess, Stacy, that's it isn't addressed to anybody,
Sure.
but I don't know if you want to take it first.
I can take a stab at it, and I think this is probably going to be one that we should open up to see if Colin and Dave. I have not had experience yet working directly with a sponsor that is headquartered out of a developing country. With that said, though, we have had employees working and sites performing at countries around the world, and whether it's a developing country or not, the area actually geographically that I've seen struggle the most is especially in Japan, and some in China with the adherence of less than 100% SDV. That's most definitely not a developing country, of course. That's a world-leading country and quite developed. But just culturally, we have seen differences around the world in how different countries are more or less open to taking a risk-based approach, and specifically when thinking about reducing their source data verification. Dave or Colin, do either of you have experience that might help with this question?
Yes, Stacy, this is Dave. I don't really have anything to add beyond those points that you just made.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Thank you.
Same here, Stacy.
Got it. So we probably have time for one or two more questions, but attendees, if you have any additional questions, please add them into the chat pod. So this question is, we're being constantly reminded to limit study data collection to only key data items. So in effect, the focus is built into the protocol and no need for defining critical data to monitor. How does that impact your recommendation?
Sure, I can take that if you all don't mind. I've got a long data background, so I'm a little passionate about this one. I agree with you. This was actually something that I thought of early on when we were first implementing RBM with companies, is that if we could just collect only critical data, then we wouldn't actually have to change what data we analyze because it's all critical. What we've seen, though, is that even when you narrow your focus to what we think is only critical in the case report forms and in what you're collecting, there are still data variables you may not care about. So, for example, let's take adverse events as an example. When you're collecting adverse events, an adverse event itself, that domain of data, may have 60 data variables that you're bringing in responses on the case report form. And some of those questions may be asked because it's important for compliance, but they may not be impactful to the overall analysis of the study or elements that would directly hit patient safety, even though it's adverse event data. So I think even if we're at a point where in a company it's fantastic if you're only collecting what you think is critical data, I'd challenge us to even dive into those domains that we're in that we do deem as critical to make sure each and every variable that we're collecting in there is critical.
Very interesting, Stacy. Dave or Colin, do you have any additional comments?
I thought that was very well. Yeah, I thought that was very well said, and I just think practically speaking, even within a protocol where we have seemingly focused our data collection efforts around a minimum number of data points and minimum number of data types, there will still be data within that protocol which are going to be much more important, or I'll say more important than others, from the point of view of ultimately interpreting the outcome of the study and basing decisions from a development point of view on the outcome of that trial. So even within a prioritized study, there will always be an opportunity, I think, to prioritize the data and the data attributes that will be more important or less important than others.
Excellent. So just one more last question here. Is there, because we already talked about how regulatory agencies are enforcing ICH E6R2 with comments earlier, but is there a deadline to comply with these requirements?
ICH E6R2 was signed off and went into effect November of 2016. Different regions, different ICH regions, different countries have adopted different dates or have indicated different dates for the effectiveness of that guideline. So recommend to everybody to understand what those effectiveness dates are given the different regions that they're operating in.
That's great, Dave. Thank you so much. So we just have a couple more minutes left, and we are almost at the close of our session here. I just wanted to take a second to thank our speakers today, Dave, Colin, and Stacy. Thank you so much for your insights and advice. I think it really helped shape, get a better understanding of what the essential elements of RBM are and how to think about RBM as a way to bring your drugs to market more efficiently. So for all of our audience members attending, just wanted to make sure you're aware that you will be receiving a copy of the presentation as well as a copy of the recording. And thank you so much, everybody, for joining. And we hope to see you at Medidata Next. That's going to be held here in October in New York City. Thank you so much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.